Welcome to the She Found Motherhood podcast. It's Dr. Alicia here, and today we will be discussing diastasis recti in pregnancy. Kim Vopni, the vagina coach, will be joining us to review what are the risk factors for getting diastasis, how can we prevent it, and if you do get diastasis recti, what are the treatment options? Kim Vopni has great courses on how to prepare your body for the big push. She uses her expertise as a fitness specialist and combines it with her knowledge of the pelvic floor and core to create an online training experience for you that gives you the knowledge and the power to be prepared for your childbirth experience. Make sure to check out our resources page at www.shefoundhealth.ca/resources to find Kim's course on how to get your body fit enough to push. Welcome to the She Found Motherhood podcast. We are Sarah and Alicia, two doctor moms who are creating a community rich with high quality information to support people through the journey from pregnancy to parenthood.
Our goal is to empower with knowledge and decrease the anxieties during this time in our lives. We cover topics from fertility through the fourth trimester, with the odd birth story sprinkled in.
Come join us on Instagram or Facebook at she.found.motherhood or check us out on our website at www.shefoundhealth.ca.
Some of these podcasts have been sponsored, which allows us to continue putting out free, amazing content. But don't worry, this won't affect our advice or recommendations, and we only partner with companies we know and trust, or have come highly recommended to us by you, our listeners.
She Found Health is meant for general medical information only. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The information you hear does not apply to every situation. If you have questions or if you've received different advice, please contact your healthcare provider. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions that you may have regarding a medical condition. The views expressed by She Found Motherhood and our guests are not representative of any institution with which we are affiliated. Hey, Kim, welcome to the She Found Motherhood podcast. We are so excited that you've come to join us today to talk about diastasis recti. Why don't we start by you telling us a little bit about who you are and how you've come to work in this field?
All right. Thank you for having me. I guess I watched a childbirth education video in grade 6, and that was, I think, kind of where it started. And I watched this with horror and I thought, nope, never doing that. And I went home, and then I also looked at my mom a little differently, and I thought, well, she did that, and my aunts, and and I had this bit of fear fascination about childbirth, and was asking my mom questions. She was a nurse, an OR nurse. She was very open with information and told me everything, and she shared stuff about episiotomies, and of course, then that was another kind of mark against pregnancy. Okay, not doing that, and so that was my growing up, and then when I decided I did want to start a family, the year before I was pregnant, I watched my sister-in-law give birth, and she was in a hospital in a side-lying position with a midwife. And I had never seen anything remotely similar to how she was birthing and how she was supported in her birth up to that point. So that was kind of a pivotal time, and it was empowering. And so I decided I did want to start a family. And the next year I was pregnant, and of course I was using midwives. I did choose to have a hospital birth. I was asking about things like, how can I prevent incontinence? How can I prevent tearing? And they had told me about a product called the Epino, which is a biofeedback device for pelvic floor training, basically. So I researched that. I had a good experience with it. Of course, I credit my midwives. I was also in a side-lying position, which is a favorable position for protecting the pelvic floor. And afterwards, I said, well, nobody that I knew used this product. Nobody had really great experiences. So I said, maybe I should become a distributor for this product. And that's kind of how it started, with not really an intention of it becoming a business, but just a side thing. And then, long story short, it did become a business. I took my fitness training. So I'm a personal trainer. I specialized in pre-postnatal initially. I also did training as a doula, and I combined those two to work with pregnant women to help them prepare their bodies for birth and optimize their recovery postpartum, seeing that things like the pelvic floor and the abdominal wall were really grossly overlooked. And so that's how it started. I then formed a second business with 2 other women, one of which was a pelvic floor physio. And we recognized that postpartum period as overlooked again as well. People weren't really honoring that process. And we were finding success from a healing perspective with people who were wrapping their pelvis and their lower abdomen. And so we didn't love the products that were available. None of them really had any sort of exercise or core retraining element to it. So we wanted to do that. So we worked on that, created a product called the AB System. And that company is now sold, actually. Bellies Inc. is the name of the company. And so that was another piece. We then started courses for professionals because we recognized there was a huge void in the fitness industry with regards to knowledge of pelvic floor and diastasis, the abdominal wall, and not even just pregnancy. It can happen really to anybody. We focused on the female body, kind of the major milestones of pregnancy, motherhood, menopause. But so basically, I'm a fitness professional with a passion for the pelvis, and I view things like incontinence, prolapse, and chronic back pain and diastasis as things that really can be addressed through movement and body awareness and consistent, correct exercise.
And needs to be talked about more. Because it is common, but not necessarily normal.
Super common, yes.
Yeah, and people need to reach out to their care providers, their pelvic physios, their fitness specialists, whomever, to talk about it more, because we hide behind it and we shouldn't.
Yes, yeah. It's women's health in general, I feel, is always sort of bottom of the totem pole, and pelvic health within women's health is also even further down at the bottom. And on the flip side, I also find, though, that even when people become more informed, not everybody is motivated and not everybody believes that they can make change with simple lifestyle changes. So there's a bit of a battle, but I find that information is getting out there a lot more thanks to social media. Of course, you have to sift through because there's a lot of people talking about it, so you don't necessarily know who else credible, but the fact that the conversation isn't happening there, at least it's prompting people to then go and seek out help and ask other care providers. So that's all a good thing.
Yeah, for sure. We did a podcast the other day on pelvic physio in pregnancy and kind of the role for it. Yes. And one of the things we were talking about for symptoms like, incontinence and pelvic floor prolapse and all those types of things is we have to remember it's a process to get to that point. And so it's a process to get away from that point too. And it involves work. But that work is often very worth it, especially if you're symptomatic from those things. And if you're not symptomatic from them, still worth doing the work so that down the road, you don't become symptomatic. So really good to get that team involved early and do the work just like you would for your, biceps if you need to carry stuff around.
Yeah.
Right?
I always equate it to dentists. We have been conditioned to brush our teeth every day and see a dentist at least once a year. And I believe we need that same press for our pelvic floor as well. And if we were introduced to the concept of pelvic floor exercise at an earlier age, and if we were introduced to the concept of kind of like a dentist for our pelvic floor, which is pelvic floor physio at an earlier age, I feel like the landscape would change significantly, and people there would be a different priority instead of an understanding or a belief about the importance of it earlier on, which I think would make a tremendous impact for sure.
Yeah, for sure. All right. But today we are talking about diastasis recti, which is very intertwined with the pelvic floor. Our abdominal musculature, our pelvic floor, our diaphragm, that's all very much intertwined because it all encapsulates our inner self. Right. All of the stuff inside of us. So it's all very intertwined, but we're going to focus mostly on diastasis recti. So Kim, why don't you tell us what that is?
Yeah. So diastasis, you may hear it pronounced diastasis. Some people say diastases. The term diastasis means separation, and recti is indicating that it's separation of the rectus muscles. We have two rectus abdominis, which is the six-pack muscles, and they're like, they're kind of like strips of bacon, one on each side of the belly button. And the thing that I point out is there's always a gap. There's always a space between the rectus muscles. So the term diastasis recti is kind of misleading in a sense because everybody has it. We all have a separation between the rectus muscles. And years in research has never 100% defined what would be considered normal interrecti distance. Everybody has different. And the challenging thing when people learn about it after the fact, after they've been pregnant per se, and then they measure and then they say, oh my gosh, I have a 3-finger separation or a 4-finger, whatever it is. But we don't know what that person's interrecti distance was before. So we don't know is it the same? Is it a huge stretch away from where they used to be. So it's a bit complicated. And when I was first investigating it, so this goes back like 15 years, almost 14 years ago, and there was very little research, and there really wasn't a whole heck of a lot of people talking about it. And there wasn't a lot of people talking about the connection to the pelvic floor either. Thankfully, more research has happened and more people have questioned early practices. So early on, when it was starting to become known and talked about, it was very restrictive, and people would say, you have diastasis, you can't do crunches, can't do planks, can't do twists, you can't do this, can't. And so all of a sudden, people's their movement library was very small, and they felt pretty restricted and didn't have a lot of hope per se. And then what happened over time, again, more research was coming out, and now the norms have been questioned, and there's a lot more freedom, I think, that's happening. So what essentially happens and leads to a diagnosis, I guess, is the connective tissue that is in between the two recti muscles, which is called the linea alba. That connective tissue, like all the tissue and muscles in our abdominal wall, stretch beyond their optimal length in pregnancy as the belly grows. And diastasis is not just pregnancy. It can happen for anybody. Somebody who had a larger abdomen. It could happen with repetitive movement. So there's lots of things that can contribute to it, but we're talking about mainly pregnancy here. So in pregnancy, as the belly grows, there's pressure on the linea alba that contributes to it thinning and stretching, and that can mean that the rectus muscles sort of migrate away from one another at that midline and leaves a gap, which that's what causes all the hysteria. People, they have a gap and they panic. And so you can self-assess, or you can have somebody assess for you. The general way to assess is with fingers, and that's not really super accurate because we all have different hand sizes. We have, there's lots of there's no inter-tester reliability basically, but at least it gives us a little bit of an idea of function. So you use your fingers to assess the gap size. So how far apart are the two rectus? Do they come together when there's a head lift, kind of like a flexion movement? And what's the integrity of the connective tissue underneath? And a lot of self-tests that you see on the internet focus just on measuring the interrecti distance. And what is now known through research is that, yes, that's a piece of information that we're not going to say is irrelevant, but it's not the most important piece as it pertains to form and function. It's really more associated with the integrity of that connective tissue. So the term diastasis is separation of the rectus abdominis. We don't know necessarily what the gap size was in a person beforehand. They're now left with this residual gap. And yes, there are certain things that may contribute to that gap narrowing, but we really want to pay attention to regaining the integrity of the connective tissue as part of the healing process.
Yeah. And I think it's really important for pregnant people to recognize that, my understanding anyways, correct me if I'm wrong, is in that third trimester, as you're getting close to term, the vast majority of pregnancies have a diastasis recti.
Yeah.
And that's just because it has to stretch your baby.
Yeah, it's considered a normal adaptation for
right?
sure.
And all of our connective tissue is loosened because we secrete hormones called relaxin getting close to pregnancy to allow more movement in our pelvic bones to birth our children. And
Right.
So all of the connective tissue is going to be looser. So the connective tissue between your pubic bones and the connective tissue and holding your hips, all of that is going to be looser during that period of time. And that's not a bad thing. That's a really functional thing for our bodies to then push a baby out of our pelvis, because it hopefully will fit. And that improves postpartum, right? So that relaxin drops down and that connective tissue becomes stronger. So I think that's really important to note is if you're pregnant, 36 weeks, and you notice that you've got a separation of those rectus, that does not mean that is going to continue forever, ever. That is a normal kind of function of pregnancy. But we have a piece of research that shows that 100% of people, pregnant people, by their third, and I think it was around 36 weeks. I can't remember exactly the week in that study, but by 34, 36 weeks, somewhere in there, have a diastasis. So again, considered a normal response to pregnancy. The internet did a really good job of increasing awareness, but also increasing hysteria around it. So people started to panic and then their movement was all restricted, and that was then creating issues in and of itself. So thankfully we've evolved from there, but
Yeah. So it's a combination between the movement of the rectus and the integrity of the connective tissue, but really the whole core system. So looking at the diaphragm, looking at the relationship between the diaphragm or the alignment of the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, the function of the pelvic floor. So there's lots of components we need to consider.
Yeah, totally. And we'll go into a little bit about kind of prevention or how we can manage it later, but let's talk a little bit about risk factors. So there's certain population who are at an increased risk factor for diastasis recti that continues on and causes functional concerns. So what would that group be? Who are we talking about in that risk factors?
Well, pregnancy in and of itself would be a risk factor. Connective tissue disorders can have an increased risk factor. Genetics, size of baby, how many babies, how many pregnancies. There's lots of factors to consider, and nothing is going to make you 100% immune to it, really. But those would be the more significant ones for sure.
Yeah, and we also quote multiples, so twins or triplets.
Yep.
So essentially, the bigger that your uterus, your belly grows out, the higher the risk for diastasis, just because it needs to make room. Same thing with women with short torsos. They don't have as much space. So you'll often see these tall women who don't look very pregnant because they've got so much room within their torso for their baby to be and push their other organs. But women with short torsos, they have to move out more.
Yeah.
And so
I also found there's no research to back this up, but just in my own, I've been doing this for many years and have assessed many abdominal walls. And I found that people who had larger hips and smaller waists actually had less diastasis than people who were more kind of the ectomorph type body. This, not a lot of hips, not a lot of difference between the hip and the waist.
Yeah. So the more pear-shaped women
was like kind of like the birthing hips, right?
Yeah. More space for that baby to sit within their pelvis as opposed to having to push out. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. That's great. So again, there's not a ton you can do about that. If you get pregnant with twins, you get pregnant with twins.
Right.
You can stay healthy. Try not to have, if you have gestational diabetes, you can make sure your sugars are controlled and eat healthy and diet and try not to have a 25-pound baby. Nobody's going to have a 25-pound baby. I exaggerate. But, keep healthy during your pregnancy. Right. But over and above that, there's a lot of the time we don't have a ton of control over this.
Right.
The only control is how we act in terms of pregnancy and keeping the rest of our muscular strong and active, and then getting a good kind of management afterwards. Those are the places that we do have control.
I think that it's something that we can pay attention to things like posture. We can pay attention to pelvic floor exercise. We can pay attention to how we're loading our abdominal wall. So we can be aware of movement and take steps to mitigate. Nothing's, again, going to 100% prevent it, but with the awareness, people can make certain choices in their movement and how they kind of hold themselves throughout the day that could help maintain that integrity in the core more so than if they didn't pay attention.
Yeah. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about now is kind of prevention. So how can we minimize the risks of having a long-term issue resulting from diastasis recti? And so kind of pre-pregnancy, during pregnancy, what can pregnant folks do to help decrease their risks?
A big one I find is posture. And when we become pregnant, early on, one adaptation that's common is the pelvis starts to tip a little bit more anteriorly. And then what I find and what my business partners and I who've worked with women over the years have found is that as the belly grows and the center of gravity starts to shift, there's a tendency to lean. The upper back starts to kind of lean backwards and the pelvis starts to shift a little bit forward. And that's almost like trying to counterbalance ourselves with that growing weight that's out in front of us. And we don't necessarily, it happens gradually. It happens kind of over time. So it's sort of an unconscious change that we're not, unless you're aware of it, you don't fix it per se. And so with that, the alignment between the diaphragm and the pelvic floor is a little bit off. The glutes become more inhibited. The stretch or the pressure that is on that linea alba is greater. So by being aware of that change and doing exercise that helps offset it, but also be aware of how you're sitting or standing throughout the day can make a difference, and making sure that, so strengthening the glutes, lengthening the hamstrings, strengthening the pelvic floor, and releasing the pelvic floor, and also doing abdominal work I'm not a huge fan of repetitive crunch exercises. And especially in pregnancy, I'm not a fan of sustained bird dog or plank, where you have the belly under the influence of gravity now, also adding more load to that connective tissue. So I choose not to load the abdomen that way, but to load it with other types of dynamic movement, like a deadlift or something. And so keeping the alignment between the rib cage and the pelvis, so that our diaphragm and our pelvic floor can work synergistically, continue to work synergistically, is really, really important. So finding neutral pelvis. I have a video on my YouTube channel that talks about posture and pregnancy and how you should be sitting and standing. But that can help, again, mitigate and reduce the load and the pressure that's put on the abdominal wall. So paying attention to how you stand and sit, making sure you're doing your pelvic floor exercise. So you said you had somebody talking about pelvic floor physio in pregnancy, which I'm a huge supporter of. And working with your pelvic floor physio can also ensure that you're maintaining your posture, that you keep the function of the coordination between the breath and the pelvic floor. When you do pelvic floor contraction, or the Kegel, like the contract and lift part of a Kegel exercise, what should be happening as a response, a co-contraction, is the deep abdominals, the transversus abdominis. So when we do that contract and lift of the pelvic floor, the belly button, when people say belly button to the spine, as a cue, a core cue in fitness, there's a natural drawing in of the deep abdominals towards the spine. So that should be happening all day long, even without us thinking about it. When our posture is off, that may not be happening quite as much. But because we know that when the pelvic floor engages, there's a co-contraction of the deep abdominals that also tensions that connective tissue and the thoracolumbar fascia, then a key part of maintaining and, we can't 100% prevent, but reducing the severity of, per se, is through the pelvic floor. We have to make sure that we're activating the pelvic floor regularly. And I believe we add Kegels to movement as well, which we can talk about after. But so how you hold yourself, making sure you're doing your pelvic floor exercise. And then as I mentioned, I'm not a huge fan of, I don't love saying you can't do that exercise. I'm not a big fan of removing things, but in pregnancy, I do believe that sustained, held, front-loaded positions, there's the cost benefit is not there for me. It's not, holding a plank is not going to help us birth better. And it just adds more load to that already stretched connective tissue. So I don't see the purpose, the benefit of doing it. So I'm not a big fan of that. So I would say avoiding those types of things. There is a lot to say that, no crunches, no forward flexion, always roll to your side and push yourself up. I agree and disagree. I don't want to say I completely disagree. I do believe, especially as we become more pregnant, then yes, rolling. And it sometimes is more accessible to get up that way anyway. And in the early weeks postpartum, to roll to the side to push up, just to help reduce, again, the load and the stretch that's being placed on that connective tissue that's already stretched and loaded beyond its optimal length.
Yeah, and that's really important if you have a cesarean section as well, because they do cut through the lower fascia to get through there. Yes. And so you literally can't do that sit-up maneuver. So you have to do that rollover sit-up. Otherwise you don't burst through your stitches, but it's uncomfortable because you pull at them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So those are the main things. There's some people could say, well, maybe I'll take some collagen and maybe that will help. I mean, there's not really research to support that that's going to help. It's not necessarily going to hurt, but that will not prevent your muscles from moving away from the midline or preventing that connective tissue from stretching. The more relevant I find is how you're standing, how you hold yourself and manage that pressure. And if you're activating your core basically correctly. Yeah.
And really understanding how all of these things come together, which you've chatted about, and some of the things, I understand what you're talking about, but a lot of people don't have the same kind of background that we do. But you actually have a course that you go through a lot of this, the Power to Push, correct?
Prepare to Push.
Prepare to Push. Sorry. Yeah. And there's a huge education component, and then there's lots of kind of real life examples of how to do exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah, because you're right. I mean, this is I wish this information was provided to us at a younger age when we were learning about menstruation and sexual wellness and all that, but it just simply isn't. And so there's a lack of information, and that's part of why I created it. I recognized there was this huge void. Nobody was talking about this. And I looked at birth as an event, just like a marathon or a mountain climb or a triathlon. And we should really be training our bodies for the event of birth. And I looked at birth positions. I looked at the demands of labor, looking at labor as being something that is actually something we should participate in actively, not something we should lie down and have done to us almost. So we want to build strength and endurance and suppleness in our muscles for the most optimal birth positions and for the dynamic and lengthy process of, people say, oh, birth is like a marathon, but it's kind of like 4 or 5 or 6 marathons, really, when you think of how long it is.
Yeah,
right?
Dr. Sarah and I always say, like, labor is like a marathon, and then the pushing is like the longest HIIT class you have ever done in your life.
Yeah.
Right? It's
Yes.
huge outbursts of energy with rest, small bits
Yes.
of rest in between.
Totally. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And we also know there's so much evidence out there about staying active and moving during pregnancy.
Yeah.
Improves your birth outcomes and also improves your postpartum kind of recovery, the speed and the effectiveness of it. And I think your course goes through all of that as well. Like, there's a postpartum recovery component as well.
Because just like
around diastasis and
totally.
pelvic health as well.
Yeah. And it's, we went back to the looking at birth as an event. If you're training for something, so if I decide I'm going to run a marathon, I'm not just going to show up on that one day and just go run. I'm going to do progressive training, and I'm going to do some cross training. And then just before I race, I'm going to have a tapering off period where I'm resting and I'm rebuilding my resources. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to do my event or my race or whatever it is. And then afterwards, there's a recovery protocol in there to help me recover what I used up, the resources that I used up. And that needs to happen in any type of training we do. And why are we not doing that with birth? And why is there not more information paid to how intentional we really should be in our recovery process to help retrain the pelvic floor, to help heal the abdominal wall, and prevent things like incontinence and prolapse and back pain and that kind of thing. So so the course goes through all of that into what diastasis is. There's lots of visuals and all sorts of different birth positions with photos from hospital or home, and then how, what exercises we use that mimic those birth positions, and then how to incorporate pelvic floor exercise into those movements.
Yeah, that's awesome. And this is like an online course that people can do at their own pace. But you also have another component that anybody who accesses your course also has an option to do. And that's kind of the Birth Like a Boss challenge, right? So this is more about an engaged group that do things together, correct?
Yeah, it was meant to, Prepare to Push is self-directed. So all the information's in there, all the exercises in there. There's videos to watch, there's workouts, but you need to open it up and go and do that. And with the challenge, it's an app where you get a daily reminder, and it's right there, all the exercises you need to do, taking into consideration that principle of specificity. It's a group that starts at the same time and ends at the same time. So you have a community of people that you're going through it together with. And it took everything from Prepare to Push and kind of made it a little bit more applicable. But it is just focused on exercise. You're not going to learn about birth positions. You're not going to learn about diastasis. You're not going to learn about pelvic floor. It's just really movement focused. But yeah, anybody who's in Prepare to Push gets free access to Birth Like a Boss. So it kind of gives you a well-rounded approach.
Nice. And we'll link that. We're huge components of, education and knowledge is power. So we'll link that course in our show notes. We also actually have it on our favorites page. So you can just go to shefoundhealth.ca/resources, I think it is. And it's on our favorite page. So you can find Kim's course through that, which is awesome. And we do get a little bit of support from Kim when people do purchase it through our links, which helps to fund all of these amazing podcasts and stuff. So we really appreciate it. If you do use those links, it's really helpful for us. Hey, Sarah, do you know what I've never asked you? Did you take a prenatal course when you were pregnant?
We did. Even though I'm a maternity care provider, my husband and I thought it would be an important process for us to go through together.
That's so cute. It must have been so hard for you guys to coordinate your busy schedules, though.
Oh, tell me about it. I was a medical resident at the time, and he was working full-time. We really struggled to find a course that would fit our needs and ended up doing a semi-private course that still was challenging to schedule and quite expensive.
Wouldn't it have been nice for you guys to have access to an online course with evidence-based content that you could do from the comfort of your own home or on your own time at your own pace?
You're telling me if I had had access to something like our Pregnancy to Parenthood Prenatal Masterclass, it would have been a game changer.
And that's the big reason we put this course together, to provide parents with access to a reliable, comprehensive prenatal education from the comfort of their own homes and the ability to watch it and rewatch it when and where they choose.
Plus, it's got so much great information about preparing for the fourth trimester, which I'll admit, I felt really unprepared for. We focus so much on labor and birth when we're pregnant without understanding how challenging breastfeeding in the fourth trimester can be.
I hear ya. And that's why we put together such a comprehensive module all about what to expect for the fourth trimester and for your newborn.
If any of you listeners are pregnant and thinking about a prenatal course, I may be biased, but I would 100% recommend our online course. Head on over to www.shefoundhealth.ca/masterclass to check it out.
We promise you won't be disappointed or your money back. All right, so we have chatted about what it is, what are the risk factors, what are the preventions, how to diagnose it. So here we are postpartum. We're 4 to 6 weeks out. We know that some of these resolve on their own. That connective tissue becomes nice and strong. Our muscles kind of come back together and we're good from a diastasis point of view. We probably have lots of weaknesses in our pelvic floor, in our, core strength, just because being pregnant does that. So really important to still go back to your pelvic physio, to do these exercises, to do your challenges and, get all that education. But what if we still have that diastasis? What if we're 6 to 8 weeks out and we're one of those, 30 to 40% of women postpartum who still have like a significant gap between those muscles? Where do we go now? What do we do now?
Yeah. So you touched on, early postpartum, and you can assess for it early postpartum if you really want to, but it's a little bit harder. The uterus hasn't shrunk down completely, and again, we know that pretty much 100% of people have it. So we can kind of accept that there will be some sort of change that has happened to the alignment of our rectus and to the integrity of that connective tissue. Hopefully, we've done some work while we're pregnant to help mitigate that, and then in the postpartum period, we want to start pretty quickly with getting that pelvic floor activated again. Because if you remember, the co-contraction happens between the pelvic floor and the deep abdominals. So that is going to help tension that connective tissue. It's going to help tension the thoracolumbar fascia, which helps improve and heal the abdominal wall. We will also want to start working on our glutes, because that also tensions the thoracolumbar fascia. And so it's really, in the early weeks, it's about retraining that system. And I'm also supporter of wrapping and giving some external support to the pelvis and the low abdomen, not waist training and not putting on something that's going to, tighten in the midsection in your waist, but more around the bones of your pelvis and then a little bit kind of just below your belly button. So that's where I like the support to be. And it's meant knowing that all the, the muscles, tissues in the abdominal wall stretch beyond their optimal length. The muscles, tissues in the pelvic floor have been under increased load, and there's either been a vaginal birth or a cesarean birth that has, again, influenced the fascia. The core, the form and force closure in our pelvis is temporarily hindered. So when we use the wrap to help with the form closure and we start to do the exercise to help with the force closure, the system can rebuild and retrain better, rather than just waiting until you're 6 weeks postpartum and then going and saying, yep, you get a clearance to go back to regular activities. And then people who have just given birth typically want to do the hardest thing possible, because then now they want to lose the weight and they want to get their body back. And they'll often go to a harder class than they were doing before. And when our pelvis, when our core hasn't regained its full function and support mechanisms, and then we go and load it with higher impact activity, it can contribute to more lengthy, not healing properly, potentially some pelvic floor challenges. So it's about starting pelvic floor initiated movement really quite quickly. I am a supporter of wrapping. If that's something that resonates with you, then that can be helpful. Seeing a pelvic floor physio at around somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks postpartum. and allow them to be the ones to give you the green light to go back to more intense activity. And we have more and more research to show that that's around 4 to 6 months postpartum, not 6 weeks. And that seems slow and it seems long and it seems daunting, but we need that time. You mentioned already, there's an adaptation that happens over a period of 9 months coupled with a birth. It's unrealistic to think that everything is just whoop back to normal by 6 weeks postpartum. So we need to take that time to initiate the pelvic floor movement, get that tensioning happening in the fascia, get the muscle memory happening. But then we also do need to add some movement. And we're not sitting around waiting for our physio to give us a green light. We are very active. And especially when you're a new parent, you have car seats to lift and strollers and babies. And we are loading our system, but we need to do it in a way where we are incorporating our pelvic floor ideally. And we're not adding significant load until several months later, but we're progressing towards there continuously. We have to load our tissue. And this is the same, like it's in the pelvis and the abdominal wall. In order for tissue to respond and things to strengthen, we need to add some load. We need to add some sort of influence to allow it to respond to. So sitting around doing nothing will not serve you. Loading it too heavily will not serve you. We need to do a kind of a gradual rebuild almost. So that's really, really essential from a healing perspective. And movements are like the bridge, clams, seated march exercise, squats, but doing them slow controlled without weight. You're doing just body weight and you're adding in the pelvic floor to tension that connective tissue and ideally encourage those muscles to return to midline. They don't always, but that's okay.
Yeah. We talk a ton about the fourth trimester and how it's so forgotten. And especially in our generation, I mean, you and I are a different generation. Well, some people my age are still having babies, not very many, but some people are. But the generation that are having babies right now, I did a podcast with one of our local specialists in perinatal mental health yesterday, and we were talking about, the expectations to just, we're all so in tune to be productive and get stuff done and get our to-do list done. And the expectation is after having a baby, you're going to get right back to it. But we have this transition time called the fourth trimester, where we and our babies are adjusting from being intricately linked to two separate, still necessary for each other, human beings. Yeah. And that takes time. So that first week, you really need to be still. You need to be bonding with your baby. You need to skin. You need to establish that breast milk if you're breastfeeding. You need to, really just be still. And then slowly working towards at 3 to 4 months being somewhat independent of each other. And that's when we, and that is a huge transition. And our bodies go through that. Our minds go through that. Yeah. And our babies go through that. Right. And so it's really, we need to respect that. And we need to give ourselves grace and compassion during that time and have no expectations of being, 4 months, I'm going to be back to running a marathon. No. Right.
Yes.
Maybe totally you'll be running at 4 months. Maybe.
Yeah.
Great if you are, but if not, that's okay too. Right.
Totally.
And so just being respectful of that process and to a sense, enjoying that process, that time to just be. Because we don't take that. And I am 100%. I was back at work at 4 months postpartum, not by choice, but I 100% get that. I was trying to go to the gym with my baby in a bucket at a month. Anyways.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. And I think that we have this, we're very driven by social media and the images that we see and that puts pressure on people. And we have lost respect. I don't know if we've ever really had it in our North American culture per se. Like there's many cultures around the world who embrace philosophies that come under an umbrella called mother roasting. And the traditional practices are all around honoring the first 40 days, because what you do during that time sets you up for the next 40 years. And the mother is nourished and the mother is cared for. The task of caring for baby. So babe is brought to the mom for feeding and for bonding, but that's it. The mom is allowed to recover, is allowed to rest, is allowed to heal. And that helps with milk production. It helps with mental health. It helps heal the body tissues. Like there's so much to consider that is overlooked in our very much doing society. And I always, in my programs, I have doing exercises and I have allowing exercises. And most people struggle with the allowing because they're trying to make something happen. And sitting and being still and letting something evolve or undo or unwind is very challenging. It's not something that we're used to experiencing. So I couldn't agree more. We have to ideally we need some sort of shift in perspective with regards to the expectations of the postpartum period, and more information and importance placed on the need to recover, the need to support the mom. We need to mother the mom or the new parent, so that healing can happen, because that makes all the other things happen with more ease, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. The term, I don't know if you've ever heard the term matrescence, but it's like
Mm-hmm.
adolescence
Yes.
of the, right? Like same
Yes.
thing. And all of those shifts, those hormonal shifts and physical shifts and all those
Yes.
things that are happening during that period of time. And we need to recognize that and allow for
Yeah.
it and give ourselves permission to not, and just be.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting over COVID, seeing the shifts, both good and bad, right? There's been increasing success with breastfeeding rates because there's just more, we have less visitors coming over, especially in the hospital. So we're like just spending more time skin to skin and being a bit more relaxed because we're forced to be more mental health issues because of the lack of support and lack of community.
Yes.
Which is part of why Dr. Sarah and I started this, is to kind of create a trusting online community. But it's been very interesting. So I'm hoping some of the things that come out of COVID is that just everybody slowing down a little bit and recognizing that that's an okay thing. But hopefully COVID will over so we can then hug each other and get our support systems into our house to care for ourselves, right? Okay, awesome. And wonderful. Anything else that you wanted to kind of talk about? One thing that I really wanted to, one myth that's out there that I really want to make sure that I'll just quickly address, is that at cesarean section, we do not cut the abdominal muscles. We do not. We do go through that sheath, that linea alba sheath. We separate the muscles, but we do not cut through the abdominal muscles. And certainly there are some surgeons, some obstetricians out there who do kind of put a stitch in the lower part of the rectus abdominal muscles to help bring them together. So certainly if you are somebody who's had multiple pregnancies and you have a diastasis from before, or if you're pregnant with twins and your physio has said, yeah, you've got really weak connective tissue, it's worth a conversation with your surgeon about whether or not that would be useful. I don't know that I've seen much change long-term around it, but I haven't really looked for it either. So certainly that is an option at surgery. Some people do it, some people don't. But I think if you were to have a conversation with your surgeon about, the risks and benefits of it, that would be an important thing to do if you are one of those risk factor people, or you have a diastasis from previous pregnancies that you've worked on with physio and it's just not really kind of come back. That might be a conversation. I don't know if you know much about that, Kim, if you've kind of seen.
Yeah, it's, as you say, there's some that do it, some that don't. I think the challenging part is that not everybody knows that it's been done. So not everybody knows to ask, and not everybody knows afterwards that it's been done. And I think that, again, that there's a communication that's lacking and an information sharing that's lacking that needs to happen. So absolutely advocate and ask your if you know you're going to have a cesarean, then definitely ask, because basically everybody, as you say, everybody who has a cesarean is going to have their muscles, they're going to be pulled apart. So there isn't, everybody already has diastasis, but definitely everybody who's doing a cesarean will. So, but yeah, so talking to your doctors about what they do if we end up in cesarean, what are your practices and what are the pros and cons? Totally agree. And the other piece that I'll touch on just quickly is exercise, because I think that there was, as I say, used to be a very, don't do this isn't diastasis safe. No. And then it started to kind of swing the other way. And then it became, it doesn't matter, you can do whatever you want. And we're going to land somewhere in the middle, and looking at it, it is in many ways an individualized approach. I'm not the biggest fan of crunches per se, but we need some flexion. Flexion is something we do in our life, and we need to have strength and function in doing that. So learning how to do it in ways that doesn't contribute to pressure against the linea alba to worsen a diastasis, doing it in ways that involves the pelvic floor so that we're not having pressure downwards on the pelvic floor is important. So it's, rather than looking at what's a diastasis safe and what's not diastasis safe, is just doing an exercise with the awareness of you. If you don't have access to a trainer or somebody, a physio who can help you monitor, if you can look in mirrors and if you can be aware of what symptoms you have or signals you might have in your body of pressure or of that kind of doming, that loaf of bread down the midline that is kind of indicative for some people. And it doesn't, the challenge with that too is that if somebody has some doming along the midline, it used to be like, oh, that you can never have that. It doesn't always mean that that's necessarily 100% bad. Generally, I like people to stay away from that, but it's about exploring movement, incorporating the pelvic floor into that movement, and then seeing how your body responds. Do you feel pressure? Do you feel heaviness? Do you feel doming? Are you holding your breath? Are you really wobbly? Like looking at what your execution of that exercise is. Also looking at what are your goals of that exercise? Why are you doing it? What do you want to accomplish? And then look at how you're doing it. And is how you're doing it taking you towards your goal or away from it? And is there a way we can do it differently? Or is there a different exercise that we could do that might achieve the same result that makes it more accessible for you? So working with a pelvic floor physio, and ideally, if you can find a trainer who has done some sort of training. So my certification is called the Core Confidence Specialist Certification. Girls Gone Strong has a good one. Jenny Burrell has a good one. That's Burrell Education. Brianna Battles is another.
Sarah Duvall's got some
Sarah
good stuff
too. Jesse Mundell. So those are a couple of people who've been doing this for a long time, who have education. And if people have taken courses with those people, then you know that trainer has an understanding of core function, how to assess for it, and help guide you in your movement.
And I just want to put in a big plug for it can improve. I have a friend who is super fit, had her babies 15 and 18 years ago, running marathons, all that stuff, but had a diastasis, like could put her fist through her upper abdomen. Diastasis, very separate. And we started doing a workout with a trainer who was very good in terms of this, just because we like to exercise together as friends and get fit at the same time. It's efficient. And over a year of doing this, not aiming for the diastasis closure, it actually came down to just 2 fingers. And it was incredible that after 10 years of having this, through kind of proper exercise and proper training and proper technique, she was able to significantly improve it. And so with proper work but you do need to put in the work.
Yes.
It can improve. So
yeah,
that's
totally.
Really
and I think that the other thing on that too is that, as you said, she wasn't doing a specifically targeted diastasis program. She was just moving. She was improving her fitness. She was loading her tissues in a variety of ways. And that's ultimately what we need to do. And I think what happened early on is when everybody was creating these diastasis programs is they were quite limited. And not to say that there wasn't some benefit there, but you reach a certain point where we need to explore other ways to load those tissues with weight or with twisting, with all the things that we said that we weren't supposed to do with diastasis before. So yeah, we need to move. We need to load our tissues, and sitting around thinking, we can't move now because we have a diastasis is not serving you. And if anything, will contribute to more atrophy. So move in varied ways, lift weights, do all the things.
Yeah. And get some guidance before you start anything like that.
Yeah.
Now, Kim, where can people find you if they want to search you out on the social media?
Vagina Coach is my social media platform for Instagram. If you look for Vagina Coach on Facebook, you'll find it. Technically, it's Vag Coach because, sometimes the word vagina is not appropriate. So
same with TikTok, I've learned.
Yeah. There's I won't go down that rabbit hole. But Twitter, I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter, but I'm Vagina Coach there too. VaginaCoach.com is my website. I'm also on YouTube. You can search for Kim Vopni or Vagina Coach on there. And so Instagram is where I spend the most time. I also have a private Facebook group called Box Talk, which is you have to answer a couple questions to come in, and it's a safe private place where people can come in and ask questions and connect with others who might have gone through the same thing. And I do weekly live Q&As in there with people. So that's I think it's about 1,100 people now. And it's a really good group, lots of great questions and a good support network. So that's another
awesome.
Great place to go. Yeah.
Great. So we will link all of those in the show notes. I'm also going to link that YouTube video that you were talking about, the posture in pregnancy, in our show notes, and we'll link to your course as well. Thank you so much for talking today.
Thank you.
It's
I
wonderful.
Really appreciate having me.
Yeah. This is such an important topic, and yet another reminder how movement is important and how our pelvic health can really make significant changes, good and
Yeah.
bad, in our
Yeah.
lives, right? And we need to talk more about it. Cool.
Yes, exactly. Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check out our website at www.shefoundhealth.ca and to sign up for our community for weekly bump blasts. Make sure to check us out on Instagram or Facebook at she.found.motherhood and head on over to your favorite podcast app and leave a review and a 5-star rating. If you enjoyed this podcast, take a pic of yourself listening to it and share it on social. Make sure to tag us on it so we know to keep making them.